Hey, Hollow Dwellers, welcome back to Jesters Hollow, a place where horror isn't measured by how loudly the game screams at you, but how quietly it follows you after it's over. There are games that want to frighten you, there are games that want to disturb you, and then there are games that want something else entirely. They want your agreement, not spoken, not conscious, just slow intentional nod that says, yes, I understand why this happened. Devotion is one of those games, and that makes it dangerous because devotion doesn't begin with violence, it doesn't begin with cruelty, it doesn't even begin with fear, it begins with love. Apartment in devotion doesn't feel haunted. That's the first mistake people make. Haunted spaces announce themselves. They rot, they crack, they reject you. This place doesn't. It feels lived in, maintained, remembered. Furniture hasn't been overturned. The walls aren't screaming their history at you. The objects are where they belong, and that's what makes it unsettling, because this isn't a place something terrible happened. It's a place something terrible was allowed to happen, slowly, patiently, with care. It's easy to say devotion is about religion. That's the easy reading, safe reading, because if belief is the monster, then people are just victims of it. But devotion never treats fate as madness. It treats it as a relief, a system, a structure, a promise that suffering isn't random. That pain can be justified if it leads somewhere. The faith in devotion doesn't arrive as fantasism, it arrives as reassurance. And reassurance is much harder to resist. The family at the center of devotion isn't broken. That's the other mistake. They don't hate each other, they don't scream constantly, they don't wake up intending to harm. They love each other deeply, too deeply. The kind of love that doesn't leave the room for doubt. The kind of love that doesn't tolerate hesitation. The kind of love that says, I know what's best because I care. And that's where devotion becomes unbearable, because it refuses to give you a villain. There is no moment where someone twirls a metaphorical mustache and crosses a clear line. Instead, there are decisions, small ones, careful ones, choices made with folded hands and lowered voice, each one reasonable on its own, each one irreversible in accumulation. Devotion doesn't give you tools to fight back, not because it wants you to feel helpless, but because no one in the house believes that they need to fight anything. There is no combat because there is no perceived threat. There is no escape because escape would mean admitting something is wrong. You move through memories that rearrange themselves not to confuse you but to justify themselves. Every shift in the space feels like a rationalization. This is necessary, this is temporary, this will help, and the game never interrupts those thoughts. It lets them finish. It asks you to witness, and that's the far crueler role. You aren't trying to stop what happened, you aren't trying to undo it, you are tracing the shape of how it becomes inevitable. The horror doesn't come from shock, it comes from recognition, because none of it feels alien. The conversation feels familiar, the compromise feels logical, the intentions feel sincere. At the same point, quietly, without ceremony, you realize you have stopped asking when things went wrong and start asking why no one stopped them. Devotion is quiet, not in the atmospheric sense, but in the ethereal sense. It leaves a space where condemnation would usually be. It never raises its voice to tell you how to feel. It never inserts its commentary to guide your judgment. The silence is deliberate, because devotion understands something most horror games avoid. People don't harm because they think they're evil. They do harm because they think they're right. And righteousness doesn't need a noise. You move through devotion gently, almost apologetically. Doors open slowly, steps are measured. Interaction feels hesitant, as if touching the wrong thing might validate something you are not ready to acknowledge. The game doesn't rush you because it doesn't need to. The outcome is already decided. You aren't here to change events. You are here to understand how they justify themselves. And understanding that is what makes this game linger. There is a moment in devotion where atmosphere changes, not because something dramatic happens, but because something clicks. You realize story doesn't hinge on terrible act, it hinges on consistency, on continuing a belief one day longer than it deserved, on choosing a certainty over doubt, on refusing to stop loving even when love becomes something else. That's the moment devotion stops being about this family and starts being about the system that protect people from admitting harm. So where does devotion land? As a game, it restrained to a point of frustration. As a horror, it refuses spectacle. As a narrative, it withholds the catharsis most players are trained to expect, and for some, that will feel like a letdown because devotion doesn't reward you with clarity, it doesn't grant you release, it doesn't let you live clean. But that refusal is the point. Devotion isn't trying to horrify you, it is trying to make you uncomfortable with how reasonable everything feels along the way. And that's why it endures, not because it scares, but because it implies. Devotion doesn't ask whether love can be dangerous, it assumes you already know the answer. What it asks instead is quieter and far harder. If love justifies everything, who decides when it should stop? That's the question that doesn't fade when credits roll. It follows you. And that's why, in the end, devotion isn't a letdown, it's a legend. Not because it's loud, but because it refuses to absolve anyone. Thank you for staying in the hollow. I will see you in the next one.